Here is a question that sounds simple, but isn't. Why did you make the last significant decision you made? Maybe it was a job you accepted or declined, a relationship you stayed in or left, a purchase that felt right, a direction you chose when there were several available. Whatever it was, you probably have an answer. You probably have a story about why you did what you did. The reasons feel clear to you. They feel like yours. They feel like the genuine account of what happened inside your mind when you made that choice. The research suggests that account is probably wrong. Not wrong in a minor or peripheral way. Wrong in a way that cuts to the center of how you understand yourself. Wrong in a way that has implications for every decision you think you've made consciously and deliberately. Wrong in a way that reveals something about human cognition that researchers themselves found so difficult to accept that many of them spent years looking for alternative explanations before concluding that the most disturbing interpretation was also the correct one. The phenomenon is called choice blindness. And alongside confabulation, the process by which the brain constructs confident explanations for things it didn't actually choose or do, it represents one of the most profound and least publicly known findings in the history of experimental psychology. Let's begin with the experiment that started it all. In 2005, a Swedish psychologist named Lars Hall and his colleague Peter Johansson published a study that would eventually be cited thousands of times and fundamentally change how researchers thought about the relationship between conscious choice and conscious explanation. The study was deceptively simple in design. Participants were shown pairs of photographs of faces and asked to choose which face they found more attractive. After making their choice, they were handed the photograph they had supposedly chosen and asked to explain why they had selected that face rather than the other one. Here is what the participants did not know. On some of the trials, the experimenters used sleight of hand to swap the photographs. The participants were handed the face they had not chosen, the face they had explicitly rejected. And then they were asked to explain why they had chosen it. What happened next is what makes this study one of the most important in modern psychology. In the majority of cases, participants did not notice the switch. They held the photograph of the face they had rejected and fluently, confidently, in detail, explained why they had chosen it, why its features appealed to them, why it seemed more trustworthy, or more attractive, or more their type. They constructed complete and coherent explanations for a choice they had never made. When participants were later told about the switch and shown the evidence, many of them refused to believe it. They insisted their explanation was accurate. They were certain they had chosen the face they were holding. The experience of having chosen it and the explanation of why felt completely real and completely theirs. Lars Hall and Peter Johansson called this choice blindness, the failure to detect a mismatch between an intended choice and the outcome of that choice, combined with the construction of confident post hoc explanations for the non-chosen option. The blindness was not to the choice itself, but to the discrepancy between the choice and the outcome. And the confabulation, the confident fabricated explanation, appeared automatically, fluently, and without any sense of invention. What made the finding so significant was not merely that people could be fooled in a laboratory. That had been shown many times. What was significant was the fluency and the confidence of the confabulation, and what it implied about the relationship between choosing and explaining. If participants could produce coherent, detailed, confident explanations for choices they had never made, this suggested that the explanatory process was not accessing the actual decision at all. It suggested that conscious explanation and conscious choice were operating on separate tracks. That when you explain why you chose something, you are not reading out a record of the actual decision process. You are constructing a plausible story after the fact, using the available information about what you chose and whatever seems like a reasonable account of why someone would make that choice. You are confabulating. The word confabulation comes from clinical neuropsychology. where it was originally used to describe a phenomenon observed in patients with certain types of brain damage, particularly damage to the frontal lobes or the hippocampus, who would produce confident, fluent, detailed accounts of experiences they had never had. A patient who could not form new memories might describe a conversation that had never taken place with complete conviction. A patient with damage to the right hemisphere might explain away obvious deficits with elaborate rationalizations. The confabulation was not lying. The patients believed what they were saying. They had no awareness that their accounts were fabricated. The explanations felt, to them, like accurate recollections. What the choice blindness research suggested, profoundly and uncomfortably, was that confabulation was not limited to patients with brain damage, that it was a normal feature of everyday human cognition, that the explanations ordinary people give for their ordinary choices are produced by the same basic mechanism, a narrative construction process that generates plausible accounts without necessarily accessing the actual causes of behavior. This idea did not emerge from nowhere. It had a long intellectual history that Hall and Johansson's work dramatically confirmed and extended. In 1977, two psychologists named Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson published a landmark paper titled Telling More Than We Can Know: Verbal Reports on Mental Processes. Their central argument was radical for its time, that people often have little or no direct introspective access to their own cognitive processes, that when people explain their choices, preferences, and judgments, they are often not reporting the actual causes, but rather invoking plausible theories about what the causes might be. Nisbett and Wilson documented case after case in which people's explanations for their behavior were demonstrably inaccurate. Participants who rated the quality of products positioned at the right end of a display consistently preferred the rightmost items, but attributed their preference to the product's quality rather than their position. Participants who had witnessed someone behave in a clumsy way were more likely to give them a lower evaluation, but explained the evaluation in terms of the person's apparent competence rather than the clumsiness they had witnessed. In each case, the actual cause of the behavior was one thing, and the explanation the person gave was another, and the person giving the explanation had no awareness of the discrepancy. Nisbett and Wilson's paper was controversial. Many psychologists found it deeply uncomfortable. It suggested that introspection, the act of looking inward to understand one's own mental states and processes, was far less reliable than virtually everyone assumed. It suggested that the stories people tell about themselves, the accounts of why they feel what they feel and do what they do, were frequently more fiction than report. The implications for how we understand human beings were enormous. If people do not have reliable access to the actual causes of their choices and behavior, then the self-understanding that most people take as foundational to their sense of agency and identity is built on something shakier than anyone had previously been willing to admit. The work of Hall and Johansson in 2005 provided the most dramatic and vivid demonstration of this principle that had yet appeared in the literature. And the decades of research that followed their original study extended the finding in directions that made it more disturbing rather than less. In subsequent experiments, Hall, Johansson, and their colleagues extended choice blindness beyond attractiveness judgments to moral and political beliefs. In one particularly striking study, participants were given a political survey asking them to rate their positions on a range of issues: immigration, taxation, social equality, criminal punishment. They indicated their views clearly. Then the researchers, using the same sleight of hand technique, presented participants with what appeared to be their own completed survey, but with some of their answers covertly reversed. A person who had indicated strong opposition to a policy was now presented with a survey showing strong support. Once again, in the majority of cases, participants did not notice the change, and once again, they fluently explained and defended positions they had just explicitly rejected. They gave reasons for views they did not hold. They elaborated on arguments for positions they had moments earlier argued against, and they reported afterward that the positions on the altered survey genuinely reflected their views. The researchers called this the political version of choice blindness, and it was arguably more disturbing than the original facial attractiveness finding because political beliefs, unlike aesthetic preferences, feel to most people like the deepest expression of their considered values and reasoning. They feel like the product of deliberate thought, of evidence weighing, of principled commitment. The idea that people could be induced to defend the opposite of their stated position without noticing, and to do so fluently and with apparent conviction, cut very close to the most fundamental assumptions people hold about their own minds. There is a concept in psychology called the introspective illusion, sometimes also described as the introspection illusion, which captures what these findings collectively suggest. The illusion is the belief that when we look inward at our own mental processes, we are observing them accurately. That introspection is like looking through a window into the actual machinery of the mind. The research on confabulation and choice blindness suggests that this is not what introspection is. It suggests that introspection is more like looking at a painting of what we imagine the machinery might look like. The painting is coherent. It is plausible. It often corresponds reasonably well to the actual machinery, but it is constructed, not observed. And the construction process has its own logic that is not the same as the logic of the actual cognitive processes it purports to represent. This connects directly to one of the most important findings in the broader psychology of decision-making. The gap between what people say influences their decisions and what actually does. Study after study, across domains from consumer choice to medical decision-making to moral judgment to political preference, has found that the factors people identify as driving their choices often bear only a loose relationship to the factors that actually drive them. The actual causes of behavior are frequently invisible to the people whose behavior they cause. Daniel Kahneman's framework of System 1 and System 2 thinking provides one way of understanding why this gap exists. System 1, the fast, automatic, unconscious processing system, generates conclusions, judgments, and preferences rapidly and without deliberate effort. System 2, the slow, deliberate, conscious reasoning system, is then often deployed not to generate the conclusion, but to justify it. The conclusion comes first from System 1. The justification comes second from System 2. And because System 2 has no direct access to the workings of System 1, the justification is constructed from whatever seems plausible rather than from what actually happened. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has made a similar argument in the domain of moral judgment. His social intuitionist model proposes that moral judgments are primarily generated by fast, automatic, intuitive processes, and that moral reasoning is primarily a post hoc justification of those intuitions rather than the actual cause of them. When people explain why something is morally wrong, they are largely constructing a post hoc rationalization of a judgment that was generated before the reasoning began. The reasoning follows the judgment. It does not produce it. Haidt's classic demonstration of this was what he called moral dumbfounding. Participants were presented with moral scenarios that were designed to trigger a strong, intuitive sense of wrongness, but that were difficult to articulate a coherent objection to. A story about two consenting adult siblings who have a single sexual encounter in complete privacy and secrecy and choose never to repeat it, suffering no emotional harm and never telling anyone. Most people judge this as morally wrong. When asked to explain why, they generate reasons. It could lead to harmful offspring. It could damage the relationship. It could create emotional confusion. When the experimenter points out that these objections don't apply in this specific case because contraception was used, no emotional harm occurred, and the relationship remained intact, people don't abandon their judgment. They search for new reasons. And when those two are countered, many people reach a point of what Haidt called moral dumbfounding. They still feel the action is wrong, they cannot explain why, but they do not revise the judgment. The feeling is primary, the reasoning is secondary, and the reasoning exists to justify the feeling, not to produce it. All of this points toward a picture of human cognition that is deeply at odds with the self-understanding that most people operate with. Most people experience themselves as primarily rational agents who form beliefs and make choices on the basis of reasons that they have access to and can articulate. The research on choice blindness, confabulation, the introspection illusion, and the relationship between intuition and reasoning suggests that this experience, while genuine, is largely a construction, that the actual causes of our beliefs, preferences, and choices are often inaccessible to conscious introspection, and that the explanations we give are largely generated after the fact by a narrative construction process that produces plausible accounts rather than accurate ones. This is uncomfortable. It should be. It challenges something that feels very fundamental about what it means to be a person who makes choices and can account for them. But understanding it is not cause for despair. It is cause for a more accurate and in some ways more compassionate understanding of what human cognition actually is. The fact that conscious explanation often confabulates rather than accurately reports does not mean that conscious reasoning is useless. It means its role is different from what most people assume. Conscious reasoning is most valuable not as a reporter of what has already happened in the mind, but as a tool for evaluating and correcting the outputs of processes that cannot evaluate and correct themselves. The gut feeling that has been produced by System 1 can be interrogated by System 2. The intuition that has generated a moral judgment can be examined for consistency, for evidence, for the possibility of bias. The explanation that has been confabulated post hoc can be tested against the actual evidence available. The gap between the mind's automatic processes and its deliberate ones is not a reason to distrust yourself completely. It is a reason to distrust yourself in the right places. To recognize that the explanation you've generated for a choice may not be the actual cause of the choice. To notice when a strong feeling of certainty about a reason may be a confabulation that feels like a recollection. To bring some epistemic humility to the stories you tell about yourself, and perhaps most practically, to be somewhat suspicious of the fluency and confidence of your own self-explanations. The research consistently shows that confabulation is not hesitant or awkward. It is smooth, convincing, and feels completely real. The most fluent and confident explanation you can give for why you chose something may be precisely the one that deserves the most scrutiny, because you are, in ways you cannot fully see, more the product of processes you don't have access to than the author of choices you can fully explain. The choice was made. The story came after, and the story, however real it feels, is not the same thing as the choice. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.